All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into judicial activism in India.
Yeah, a topic that's obviously super relevant for UPSC aspirants out there.
Definitely, but honestly, it's fascinating for anyone who wants to get a better grasp on how power dynamics actually play out in the democracy.
Absolutely. I mean, at its core, we're talking about,
Like the courts kind of stepping up.
yeah, exactly. When courts take a more, I guess you could say, proactive role in protecting citizens' rights.
Sometimes even pushing those boundaries of what we traditionally think of as the court's role.
Exactly.
So in this deep dive, I kind of want to explore, like, why did this whole idea even emerge in India? Who are the big players, the ones really driving this movement? And is judicial activism, like, always a good thing?
Right. Are there any downsides?
Yeah, what are the potential downsides we should be thinking about? So, while the concept might have originated in the U.S.
It really took root in India in the 1970s.
Yeah, the 70s.
Thanks in large part to some pretty influential judges like V.R. Krishna Iyer and P.N. Bhagwati.
Those are some big names, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And, to really understand their impact, you have to think about the context.
Like what was happening in India at the time.
Exactly. India was still grappling with, well, tons of issues,
Oh,
huge social inequalities, and
lots of government inaction, I'm guessing.
you got it. So the judiciary kind of stepped in to fill that void.
Yeah.
And to make sure basic rights were actually being upheld.
Makes sense. So, like, what really fueled this whole judicial activism thing? I mean, what were the specific things that made it take off?
Well, our sources point to a few key factors, like
Yeah, let's hear them.
first, there was this widespread feeling that both the legislature and the executive,
Like the government, basically.
yeah, that they were failing to really fulfill their duties.
Interesting.
And on top of that, you had citizens who were, well, they were basically looking to the judiciary as their protector.
Makes sense. If the government's not doing it, who else do you turn to?
Right. And then, of course, you have the judges themselves.
Like, what was their motivation?
Well, many of them genuinely wanted to participate in social reform.
It's like they saw a chance to use their position to actually make a difference.
Exactly. And this is where the whole concept of public interest litigation, or PIL, comes in.
Right, PIL.
That was a big deal.
Huge. It basically empowered ordinary citizens to seek justice, even if they weren't directly affected by an issue.
So it's like anyone could go to court and say, hey, this is wrong and it needs to be fixed.
Yeah, even if it wasn't directly impacting them personally.
So like if you saw pollution in your local river, you could file a PIL.
Exactly. It really opened up access to justice in a way that hadn't been seen before.
Wow. So who were these people, these activators, as Upendra Baxi calls them, who really pushed for this judicial intervention?
Well, Baxi actually created this fascinating typology of activists.
Oh, a typology.
Yeah, like different categories, You had everything from those classic civil rights groups to consumer rights advocates and environmental
Absolutely. And even those advocating for the rights of, well, some of the most vulnerable groups, like children born to sex workers.
It's amazing, how this whole concept of judicial activism really touched upon so many different aspects of Indian society.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that while many people saw it as a positive force,
Like a way to address these injustices that maybe weren't being tackled by the government.
yeah, there were others who were, well, a little more apprehensive.
They had some concerns, right? Like,
Yeah.
hold on a second. What are the potential downsides to all this?
Exactly.
So in part 2 of our deep dive, we're going to really unpack those concerns and,
We'll look at some specific examples.
yeah, like how did this actually play out in real life?
Yeah.
And then we'll also dive into that counter-argument, that whole idea of judicial restraint.
Right. What does it even mean?
So stay tuned, folks, because things are about to get really interesting.
So remember how we were talking about Upendra Baxi and his,
Typology of fears.
Yeah, exactly. One of the big ones, like we touched on earlier, was that whole idea of judicial overreach.
Right, like our judges going too far. Stepping outside their lane, so to speak.
Exactly. And the concern was that judges, even though they're experts in law,
Might not actually have the specific knowledge to make informed decisions in every area.
right, like when it comes to really complex stuff like economic policy or environmental regulations,
You need a different kind of expertise.
totally. So the fear was that even if a judgment was made with good intentions,
It could still end up having all these unintended consequences.
yeah, like maybe it ends up hurting the economy or slowing down progress.
So it's like you try to protect a vulnerable community, but then the ruling accidentally discourages investment or creates a ton of red tape.
Exactly. And then there's this other concern that, relying too much on the judiciary could actually weaken democracy in the long run.
Interesting. How so?
Well, the thinking is that if people get used to the courts just solving all their problems, they might stop engaging in political activism or holding their elected officials accountable.
I see. It's like bypassing the whole democratic process and going straight to the courts for every issue.
Right. And remember how we talked about PIL being this great tool for empowering citizens?
Yeah, giving them a voice.
Well, some people argue that its overuse has actually led to this flood of litigation.
Oh, wow. So the courts are getting swamped.
Yeah, and that means the whole system gets bogged down, leading to delays for everyone.
Even for those who might not have the resources to keep fighting for years.
Exactly. It's almost like this paradox, right?
Yeah, the very tool that's supposed to make justice more accessible could end up hindering it in a way.
It's complicated for sure. And here's another concern, especially for you UPSC folks out there.
Hit us with it.
What happens if people start losing trust in the judiciary?
Because they see it as overstepping too often.
Yeah. I mean, unlike the other branches of government, the judiciary doesn't really have the power of the purse or the sword, right?
Right. They can't control the money or the military.
So their authority rests almost entirely on their moral authority, you know?
And the public's perception that they're fair and impartial.
Exactly. So if that perception gets damaged, it could really weaken the whole system.
Now, I remember reading about a landmark Supreme Court judgment in 2007 that kind of addresses all of this.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. A really crucial case study for understanding the whole idea of judicial restraint.
So what did it say, basically?
Well, it basically said that judges must know their limits, you know?
Okay, stay in your lane.
Exactly. And they shouldn't try to run the government. Like, they even use the term judicial adventurism.
Wow, strong words.
It's like the court drawing a line in the sand and saying, look, we have a role to play, but we also need to know our boundaries.
Okay, so respect the separation of powers.
Exactly. And the judgment also stressed that judges should really defer to the expertise of administrative authorities. You know, like, don't interfere unless absolutely necessary.
So basically, each branch of government has its own area of expertise,
Yeah.
and they should respect each other's turf.
Right. Now, this 2007 judgment was a pretty clear push for judicial restraint, but
Does that mean all judicial activism is bad?
not necessarily. It's important to remember that both activism and restraint are just approaches, you know.
Tools in the toolbox.
Yeah, and the right balance between them is always going to be up for debate.
It's like that tightrope we were talking about earlier, trying to find that sweet spot.
Exactly. And for our UPSC friends, understanding this debate is super important. Like, you need to be able to analyze specific cases.
Spot those examples of activism and restraint.
Yeah. And then think critically about their impact. Like, did they work? Were there any unintended consequences?
So it's not just about knowing the definitions. It's about applying those concepts to the real world and forming your own opinions.
Exactly. And remember, Upendra Baxi's typologies are a great resource for that kind of analysis.
Right, they can help you really break down those motivations and concerns.
Now, to really illustrate this whole tension between activism and restraint, let's look at some specific examples from Indian legal history.
Let's get into the nitty-gritty, see how this actually played out in real cases.
Perfect. Because sometimes abstract ideas are easier to grasp when you can see them in action, you know?
So we've been, like, walking this tightrope all episode, right? Trying to figure out how the courts balance their power with, the desire for positive change.
Yeah, and it's definitely not a simple thing, is it? Like, every case comes with its own set of challenges.
Absolutely. And speaking of challenges for our UPSC folks out there, this whole debate about judicial activism and restraint, it's like guaranteed to pop up on your exams.
Oh, yeah, you can bet on it.
So any advice on how to really nail this topic?
Well, first off, it's not enough to just know the definitions, right? Like, you got to show that you really understand the nuances.
Like the historical context and all the arguments for and against.
Exactly. And the landmark judgments, those are super important, too.
So it's not just about memorizing a few key terms.
No way. Like, take that 2007 judgment we talked about, the one calling for restraint.
Yeah, the one where the court basically said, judges, know your limits.
Right. You got to be able to analyze its impact, like how it's been interpreted by legal scholars and whether it's actually shifted things towards more restraint.
It's about connecting the dots, showing that you can think critically about this stuff.
Exactly. And don't forget about Upendra Baxi's typologies either.
Well, yeah, those are gold.
Seriously. They give you this awesome framework for analyzing the motivations behind judicial activism and all the anxieties surrounding it.
It's like a cheat sheet for understanding the different players and how they all interact.
You got it. Now, for everyone listening, whether you're prepping for the UPSC or just interested in how our legal system works, I think the big takeaway here is this. Judicial activism, it's not the static thing, right? It's an ongoing debate that's constantly shaping